Assisi, Italy, a jewel of stone perched on the slopes of Mount Subasio. The year is 1181, the century of crusades and cathedrals. In a house filled with fine fabrics and foreign perfumes, a child is born to Pietro Bernardone, a wealthy merchant just returned from France. Out of pride for his success abroad, Pietro names his son Francesco, the Frenchman. From his first breath, the boy is wrapped in silk. His cradle is carved from walnut, his first toy a silver bell. As the seasons pass, Assisi watches him grow into a young man of charm and energy. He sings in the taverns, organizes lavish feasts, and walks through the piazzas with gold-threaded sleeves that shimmer in the sunlight. He loves poetry, wine, and laughter. The townspeople call him the King of Youth. To Pietro, he is the heir who will one day multiply the family fortune. Yet beneath the laughter, something stirs, a quiet ache Francis cannot name. At night, when the city sleeps, he climbs the hill above Assisi and looks out across the valley. The moonlight glows on the distant plain, and he feels a pull, an emptiness no music or wine can fill. Still, he hides it behind a bright smile. In a world ruled by money and pride, no one wants to hear a young man speak of longing. In the Italy of the 12th century, glory is earned not in silence, but on the battlefield. Every noble family dreams of sons in armor, banners shining in the sun. When war breaks out between Assisi and the rival city of Perugia, Francis sees his chance. "At last," he boasts, "I will win honor and a title worthy of my name." He rides through the gate on a white horse, helmet gleaming, his friends cheering behind him. Pietro watches from the wall, proud tears in his eyes. His son, the merchant's boy, will become a knight. But the songs of war soon die. The clash at Collestrada turns to chaos. Francis sees friends cut down beside him. The air fills with the iron smell of blood and dust. Before the battle ends, he is thrown from his horse and taken prisoner. The silks of Assisi are traded for chains of Perugia. Months pass in a dark cell. Disease crawls through the straw. Men moan in the night. Francis, the Prince of Laughter, lies awake staring at the stones. Somewhere in the silence, he hears a voice, not outside, but within. "Francis, what are you chasing?" It is not accusation, but invitation, a whisper that unsettles the soul. When peace finally comes, his father pays the ransom. Francis returns home pale and changed. His friends rush to celebrate, but the music feels false, the jokes hollow. He tries to revive the old joy, yet the laughter tastes like ash. Something in him has broken, and through that crack, light is beginning to enter. Still, he clings to one last dream. If not glory in Assisi, then perhaps on a grander stage. He buys new armor, brighter than before, determined to join the papal army in the Crusades. The people cheer again as he departs. But somewhere beyond the hills, destiny waits, not with a crown, but with a question that will strip him of everything he owns. The morning light spills over the Umbrian plain like molten gold. Bells echo from the towers of Assisi as young men mount their horses, armor flashing, hearts burning for honor. Among them rides Francesco Bernardone, no longer the merchant's son, but a knight in his own imagination. His armor gleams, his cloak ripples crimson in the wind, and he feels invincible. War is the stage upon which he believes destiny will finally notice him. The songs he once sang in taverns now become battle hymns. He dreams of victory, of banners bearing his name, of returning to Assisi crowned in glory. In his mind, God himself must surely be pleased with such courage. But glory is a fragile mask. The battle at Collestrada is short and brutal. The young men of Assisi charge with shouts and bright banners, then collapse beneath the cold efficiency of Perugia's soldiers. Screams replace song, steel meets flesh. The valley becomes a graveyard of shattered armor. Francis is thrown from his horse, beaten, and dragged through the mud. He is imprisoned in a stone cell with other survivors, nobles and thieves alike, where the air stinks of rot and despair. Weeks fade into months. The laughter of his youth decays into silence. Fever seizes him, and the nights become a blur of pain and delirium. In that darkness, something or someone speaks, a voice unlike any he has known. "Francis, who can do more for you, the servant or the Lord?" He stirs, eyes burning with fever. "The Lord," he whispers. The voice replies, "Then why serve the servant?" When the gates finally open and ransom frees him, Francis steps into the sunlight, not as the boy who rode to battle, but as a man haunted by a question he cannot silence. His friends welcome him home with laughter and music, but he no longer fits among them. The wine tastes bitter, the songs sound shallow, his old joy has turned to restlessness. Still, he clings to one last illusion. If not in Assisi, then perhaps in a higher war, one blessed by heaven. He decides to join the crusade in Apulia, serving under Count Walter of Brienne, a nobleman favored by the Pope. He buys new armor, polished to mirror brightness, and a cloak embroidered with gold lilies. To his father, it is redemption. To Francis, it is purpose. One dawn, he mounts his horse and rides south. The road stretches through olive groves and dusty plains. Yet the further he travels, the heavier his heart grows. That same voice returns, not in thunder, but in a quiet certainty that pierces his soul. "Francis, return to Assisi. There you will be told what to do." He tries to resist. He argues aloud in the empty fields, ashamed of his own trembling. But the words cling to him like chains. Fever strikes again, forcing him to rest near Spoleto. In a dream, Christ appears, radiant and sorrowful. "Francis," the vision says, "why seek honor from men when I have greater honor to give?" When he wakes, the morning is still. The wind carries no sound but his own breathing. His armor glitters beside him untouched. Slowly, he rises, looks toward the horizon, and turns his horse around. The road to Assisi feels longer than before, not because of distance, but because he is no longer the man who left it. He rides home not in triumph, but in silence, carrying nothing but a question that will change the world. Assisi receives Francis like a ghost. He rides through the same gate he once left to cheers, but now no trumpets sound. The familiar streets feel foreign. Friends rush to greet him, expecting the old laughter, but his eyes no longer shine with the same light. He smiles politely, but the revelry feels distant, like an echo from another life. Pietro Bernardone, his father, cannot understand. "You were born for greatness," he insists. "You will not waste your youth in melancholy." He dresses Francis in the finest garments, hosts feasts, and fills his purse with silver. But the more Francis tastes of wealth, the more it turns to dust in his mouth. He begins to slip away from the city's noise, wandering into the hills, listening for the voice that spoke in the dark. One afternoon, he stops before a small broken chapel on the edge of town, San Damiano. Its roof is half collapsed, its altar cracked, the crucifix faded by centuries of candle smoke. Inside, silence reigns, thick and sacred. Francis kneels before the painted Christ, his heart aching with confusion. "Lord," he whispers, "what do you want me to do?" Then, in the stillness, something impossible happens. The figure on the crucifix seems to move, the painted lips speaking words that tremble through the air. "Francis, rebuild my church, which you see is falling into ruin." He freezes. The voice is gentle yet commanding, like wind through stone. Francis bursts into tears. "Yes, Lord," he stammers, "I will do so." Taking the words literally, he leaps into action. He begins repairing the chapel brick by brick. He carries stones on his shoulders, begging for mortar and timber. To fund the work, he sells bolts of fine cloth from his father's warehouse, and even the horse he rides. When Pietro hears of it, rage consumes him. "You dare steal from me to build your fantasies?" He drags Francis through the streets, striking him before the crowd. Neighbors whisper, "The merchant's son has gone mad." Pietro hauls him before the bishop, demanding repayment and renunciation. The church courtyard fills with onlookers, merchants, priests, beggars, all drawn to the scandal. Francis stands trembling. Then, with slow, deliberate calm, he begins to remove his clothes, first his cloak, then his tunic, until he stands naked in the cold air. He places the folded garments and his purse at his father's feet. "Until now," he says, voice clear. I called Pietro Bernardone my father, but from this day on I can say only, Our Father who art in heaven. The crowd gasps. The bishop steps forward, covers Francis with his own rough cloak, and says softly, You have given everything to God. Now walk free. At that moment, something extraordinary happens. The young man who had lived for silk and applause now stands barefoot, clothed only in faith. The jeers fade. Even the wind seems to pause. The boy of Assisi is gone. In his place stands a man reborn, unknown, unarmed, unafraid. He leaves the square and walks into the fields beyond the city walls. The sun breaks through the clouds, flooding the plain with golden light. He does not look back. Every step away from Assisi feels like shedding another layer of the world. In the distance lies San Damiano, the ruined church waiting for his hands, and the beginning of a mission that will rebuild far more than stone. He walks barefoot along the dusty road, a tattered cloak around his shoulders, the wind tugging at the edges. The hills of Umbria rise and fall around him, quiet and eternal. Somewhere behind him lies Assisi, the city of his birth, the home of his laughter, and the grave of his old life. Before him stands only the open plain, the whisper of the spirit, and the sound of his own footsteps. Francis sleeps beneath olive trees, drinks from streams, and begs crusts of bread from strangers. He feels no shame. The gold that once chained him now feels meaningless. Each sunrise seems to speak to him in the same voice that once came from the crucifix, gentle, insistent, alive. But not everyone sees holiness in his poverty. When he returns to Assisi's outskirts to beg stones for rebuilding the chapel, the townsfolk mock him. Children chase him, shouting, "Madman! Beggar!" Merchants turn their faces away. Even his old friends cross the street rather than greet him. Francis only bows his head and thanks them. For the first time, insults do not wound him, they purify him. The boy who once feared ridicule now feels light as air. One day, as he walks the road between Assisi and the valley, he sees a leper approaching. The man's body is ravaged, flesh eaten away, his face disfigured beneath a hood. The smell of decay fills the air. Instinctively, Francis recoils. Every noble in Assisi avoids lepers. Their disease is a curse, a reminder of mortality. But then something deep within him speaks. If you love only what is clean, you do not yet love as God loves. He stops, trembling. Then, with sudden resolve, he runs to the leper, throws his arms around him, and kisses his hand. For an instant, the man's eyes, clouded and grey, fill with light. Francis gives him alms, remounts his small donkey, and rides away. When he looks back, the road is empty. The leper is gone. Later he will say, "What before seemed bitter to me was changed into sweetness of soul and body." After that moment, Francis's heart bursts open with compassion. He begins to serve in leper colonies, washing wounds, feeding the sick, and sleeping among them. In their suffering, he finds Christ's face. Each day he returns to the broken chapel of San Damiano, gathering stones one by one. Slowly the walls rise, his hands bleed from the labor, but he smiles through the pain. When townspeople ask what he's building, he answers simply, "The house of God." Yet within him, the meaning of those words deepens. The more he restores the church's stones, the more he senses that the real ruins are not in buildings, but in hearts. Sometimes, at dusk, villagers see him standing before the little crucifix, singing in a soft voice. Birds gather on the chapel roof as if listening. Even the wind seems gentler around him. But Assisi itself is changing. Wealth has divided the town. Nobles against merchants, rich against poor. The church, too, is swollen with power and politics. Amid the noise of greed and ambition, the ragged figure kneeling in the dust looks like a man from another world. Francis doesn't notice their stares anymore. His eyes are fixed on the horizon, where the sun spills light over the plain. He feels only peace, an unearthly joy that no mockery can steal. In the ruined chapel, beneath the fading crucifix, a quiet revolution has begun. Morning mist drifts over the olive groves of Assisi. A bell tolls faintly from the city above, but down in the plain, another rhythm sounds. The steady thud of stone against stone. Francis works alone at the chapel of San Damiano, sweat streaking his face, hands raw from labor. His tunic is patched, his sandals worn to threads. He hums quietly as he lifts each rock, as though the weight of the world has finally become light. The villagers watch from a distance. The merchant's son has gone mad, they whisper. He could have lived in silk and gold, yet here he is building walls for birds. But some pause before laughing, moved by something they cannot explain, for there is joy in the way he works, simple, radiant and free. Weeks pass. The chapel rises from ruin, not in grandeur but in grace. Francis rebuilds 2 more small churches nearby, San Pietro and the tiny Portiuncula nestled in a grove of oaks. There, amid birdsong and sunlight, he begins to pray as he never had before. The voice of God, once faint and mysterious, now feels close, like breath against his ear. One morning, as he reads the gospel, the words pierce him like fire. Take nothing for your journey. No gold, no silver, no staff, nor shoes. Preach that the kingdom of heaven is near. Francis lowers the book and stares at the ground. Then slowly a smile spreads across his face. This, he whispers, this is what I was meant to do. From that day, he renounces everything that remains. No possessions, no coins, not even a walking stick. He exchanges his patched tunic for a rough brown habit, tied with a simple rope. When he walks through the fields, his voice rings out, peace and good to you. People begin to listen. At first, it's the poor, the shepherds, the beggars, the forgotten. They see in him something they've never found in priests or merchants. A man who believes what he says. Then others join him. Bernard of Quintaval, a wealthy lawyer who sells all he owns. Peter Catani, a knight tired of war. Within a year, a dozen men walk beside Francis, barefoot and laughing. They call themselves fratres minores, the lesser brothers. Together, they wander the countryside, preaching repentance, not with threats, but with joy. They sing in marketplaces, sweep streets, nurse the sick, and share whatever bread they are given. The villagers begin to call them the penitents of Assisi, but not all hearts are softened. Church officials view them with suspicion. Nobles sneer. Poverty is easy when you never had power. Even Pietro Bernardone, now old and bitter, spits the name of his son like a curse. He could have been a prince among merchants, he snarls, and he chose rags. Francis only smiles. I have found a treasure that cannot be stolen, he says. Why would I trade it for dust? By night, the brothers gather beneath the stars, their campfire glowing against the dark hills. Francis speaks softly. Brothers, we have no walls, no gold, no weapons. Yet we have the gospel. That is enough. Above them, the constellations shimmer like the lamps of heaven. The wind rustles through the oaks, and it seems for a moment as if the earth itself listens. In the silence of Umbria, a movement is being born, one that will shake thrones, humble empires, and rebuild the church not from marble, but from living hearts. By 1209, the hills of Umbria echo with a new sound, not of armies or merchants, but of barefoot men singing psalms in the streets. Francis and his 12 companions walk through towns and villages, preaching repentance, peace, and joy. Their laughter carries further than sermons, and their poverty speaks louder than any cathedral bell. But their message is too strange to ignore. Some call them saints, others call them heretics. Bishops send word to Rome. Who are these men who beg without shame and claim to rebuild the church with nothing but songs? Francis knows their path cannot continue without guidance. One morning, after prayer, he tells his brothers, "We must go to Rome and ask the Holy Father to approve our way of life." The others look at him, stunned. Rome is a world away, vast, glittering, full of danger for poor men in rags, but Francis's conviction burns like a torch. If this is God's work, he says simply, he will open the doors. They set out on foot, sleeping in barns, eating whatever scraps they find. When they finally reach the Eternal City, the contrast is overwhelming. Marble palaces gleam beneath the sun. Silk-robed cardinals glide through the courtyards of the Lateran. Dust-streaked and barefoot, the brothers are stopped at the gates, mistaken for beggars. Yet Francis insists, "We come to see the Pope." Inside, Pope Innocent III, the most powerful man in Christendom, listens to cardinals mocking the petition. "A band of fools," they sneer, "preaching without training, living like beasts." But Innocent hesitates. He recalls a dream from nights before. A tiny, ragged man holding up the collapsing walls of the Lateran Basilica with his shoulders. Now, looking at Francis, he feels the echo of that vision. Francis kneels before him and begins to speak, not with eloquence, but with fire. He speaks of Christ poor and crucified, of love stronger than law, of joy in nothing but the gospel. The hall falls silent. When he finishes, the Pope rises slowly and says, "My son, your faith is your rule. Go, and may the Lord prosper what he has begun through you." Approval is granted, not yet written, but spoken. It is enough. When Francis leaves Rome, the brothers sing for joy. For the first time, their movement has a name: Ordo Fratrum Minorum, the Order of the Lesser Brothers. The Franciscan way has begun. They return to Assisi barefoot and radiant. Crowds gather, drawn not by miracles or relics, but by simplicity itself. They mend roads, feed the poor, and greet every soul with the same phrase: Pax et bonum, peace and good. But for Francis, joy and fear intertwine. As his name spreads, he begins to withdraw to solitary places, caves, mountain forests, ruined chapels, where only the wind and birds hear his prayers. He fears the creeping pride that success brings. "If I boast of anything," he tells his brothers, "it is of my weakness, for in it God is strong." In those quiet hours of solitude, animals draw near without fear. Birds perch on his shoulders. Wolves approach, calm and curious. Nature itself seems to recognize a soul restored to harmony. And yet beneath the peace, Francis senses another trial ahead. Not from Rome, not from the world, but from within his own growing order. For the more his followers multiply, the harder it becomes to protect the purity of what began in the dust. A movement has been blessed. Now it must survive success. The years that follow are a whirlwind of dust, laughter, and miracles. What began with 12 barefoot dreamers becomes a tide of hundreds. From Assisi to Siena, from Rome to the mountain valleys, the lesser brothers travel on foot, clothed in coarse brown tunics. Their only possessions are rope, a gospel, and a song. They sleep under hedges, share food with lepers, and preach in marketplaces where merchants pause mid-trade to listen. No cathedral can match their joy. When they enter a village, they bring no threats of hell, only a contagious peace. Children run after them, shouting, "Francesco! Francesco!" Farmers wipe their hands and weep. Even soldiers, hardened by war, bow their heads. Francis leads them not as a general, but as a brother among brothers. He insists they own nothing, carry nothing, and answer every insult with kindness. "If someone steals your cloak," he says, "give him your tunic as well. It will free you both." But success carries its own danger. As their numbers swell, arguments arise. Some brothers want houses to shelter the sick, others want rules to protect the growing order. Francis resists. "The moment we own anything," he warns, "we cease to be poor. And when we cease to be poor, we cease to be free." He withdraws often to pray on Mount Subasio, where he sleeps on the bare ground and speaks to God like a child to a father. There the stars seem closer, and the forest feels alive with praise. One evening, while meditating beneath the trees, birds gather around him in a circle. He smiles and preaches to them as he would to men. "My brothers, thank your Creator for the air that lifts your wings and the fields that feed you. Be faithful to your calling and sing his glory always." The birds chirp and flutter as if answering amen. News of the Saint of Assisi spreads far beyond Umbria. His fame reaches Rome, and even distant courts whisper of him. Yet Francis flinches from praise. He reminds his brothers, "If they call me holy, it is because they do not know how much sin I hide." When he hears of a crusade being called in the East, Francis feels a strange tug. Unlike others, he does not crave conquest but conversation. He dreams of meeting the enemy, not with sword or sermon, but with peace. If Christ ate with sinners, he says, why should we not speak with our enemies? Against all warnings, he sails for Egypt in 1219, where armies clash beneath banners of the cross and crescent. Through smoke and slaughter, he walks unarmed across the battlefield, singing, "The Lord is my shepherd." Captured by Muslim soldiers, he is brought before Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil. The court expects mockery or execution. Instead, Francis bows and greets the ruler with warmth. For days they speak, not of war, but of God, compassion, and truth. The Sultan, moved by his courage, spares him and calls him a man touched by heaven. When Francis returns to Italy, his brothers rush to him as though from the grave. His journey has changed nothing outwardly. He brings no relic, no conquest, but inwardly he burns brighter. We are not called to win, he tells them softly, only to love. But while he was gone, the order has grown beyond recognition. Monasteries rising, hierarchies forming, and ambition creeping into simplicity. Francis sees it and grows quiet. The movement born in freedom now trembles under its own weight. One evening, he gazes at the valley below Assisi, golden in the dying sun. Perhaps, he whispers, to preserve the spirit, I must lose the rule. He senses another calling, a final ascent into the wilderness, where only silence can speak what words no longer can. By the year 1224, Francis of Assisi is no longer the vibrant youth who once danced through the streets. His body is frail, his eyes dim, his voice softened by years of prayer and pain. The movement he founded now stretches across Europe, yet the man who began it feels smaller, quieter, more distant from the noise of admiration that surrounds him. He longs for solitude, the kind of silence where the soul can breathe. So, he withdraws to the wilderness of Mount Laverna, a lonely ridge of forests and rocks that seems suspended between heaven and earth. The brothers build him a small hut near a grove of pines, but Francis spends most of his days in the open, fasting, praying, and listening to the wind. Autumn cloaks the mountain in mist. The air grows sharp, the nights colder. Each morning, Francis kneels before a rough wooden cross, whispering, "My God and my all." He prays not for comfort, but for understanding, how to love as Christ loved, how to suffer without bitterness, how to give without measure. Weeks pass in silence, broken only by birdsong and the rustle of leaves. Then, one dawn, as the first light spills through the fog, a vision descends upon him. Out of the rising sun appears a fiery seraph, a six-winged angel, radiant and crucified. From its wounds pour beams of light that pierce the sky. Francis falls to the ground, trembling. The light strikes his hands, his feet, his side. Searing pain explodes through his body. He cries out, not in fear but in awe. When the vision fades, he lies motionless, the mountain utterly still around him. Slowly, he opens his hands and sees the marks, nails of flesh, wounds that bleed but do not close. The first stigmata, he hides them, binding his hands in cloth. He cannot bear the thought of pride disguised as holiness. But the brothers notice the stains, the way he walks in agony, yet smiles as though joy has consumed the pain. Word spreads and pilgrims begin to climb Laverna seeking miracles. Francis weeps. "Do not look at me," he pleads. "Look at Christ." But the marks are undeniable. The man who once renounced all possessions now bears on his body the imprint of the crucified. From that day, his health declines rapidly. He loses his sight, suffers constant fever, and can scarcely stand. Yet his spirit grows lighter. To his brother's sorrow, he begins calling his illnesses by gentle names. Brother Fire, Sister Pain, Lady Blindness. He thanks them as companions sent by God to purify his heart. During one sleepless night, as his wounds throb, he murmurs to the stars, "Lord, if I must bear this, let me bear it with joy." And from his lips emerges a hymn, the canticle of the creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures. For Brother Sun who gives us light, for Sister Moon and the stars, for Brother Wind and the air, for Sister Water, humble and pure. The song rises through the forest, carried by wind and echo, until it seems the mountain itself joins in praise. Francis has touched the mystery he sought all his life, the union of suffering and joy, death and resurrection, earth and heaven. But the vision has cost him everything. His body fades, his order drifts from his hands. As he descends from Laverna for the last time, leaning on a staff, he smiles through exhaustion. "I have done what was mine to do," he says softly. "May Christ now teach you what is yours." The year is 1226. Autumn rests over Assisi like a benediction of gold and dust. The valley glows under the fading sun. Olive leaves shimmer in the wind, and swallows trace silent arcs across the sky. Inside a small hut near the chapel of the Portiuncula, the man who once shook the world now lies upon the bare earth, wrapped in borrowed cloth. Francis is 44, but looks twice that age. His body is frail, nearly blind, his voice a whisper. Yet his spirit burns with the same flame that once lit the hills of Umbria. Around him gather his brothers, Bernard, Leo, Rufino, men who once followed him barefoot through laughter and storm. Now they kneel in tears, watching their leader fade like a candle nearing its end. Francis smiles at them. "Do not weep, my brothers. I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what is yours." He asks to be laid directly on the ground, for even in dying he wishes to own nothing. "My sister Death is coming," he murmurs. "I will meet her as I met the leper, without fear." Outside, the world seems to hold its breath. Evening light pours through the doorway, warm and golden, falling across his face. He begins to sing. The voice is fragile but steady, the same hymn born on Mount Laverna months before. The canticle of the creatures. "Praised be you, my Lord, through brother sun, who brings the day and gives us light. Praised be you through sister moon and the stars, bright and precious in the heavens. Praise be you through brother wind and through sister water, humble and chaste. Praise be you through sister mother earth, who sustains and governs us, bringing forth fruits, flowers and herbs." His brothers join him softly, their voices trembling like prayer. The little hut fills with song, and it seems for a moment that all creation sings with them. The birds outside, the rustling of the olive branches, the breath of the wind itself. As night falls, Francis grows weaker. The pain of the stigmata burns, yet he welcomes it as union rather than torment. "Christ," he whispers, "you have given me more than I ever deserved." He lifts a trembling hand and traces the sign of the cross in the air. When the moon rises above the chapel roof, he asks to taste bread one last time and to hear the Gospel of John read aloud. Before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, he closes his eyes. Now mine has come as well. A silence deeper than night fills the room. Then, as if summoned by his song, a lark begins to sing above the roof. The bird he loved most, the one he said never ceased praising God even in flight. The brothers look upward, tears streaming down their faces. Francis smiles faintly. "Welcome, Sister Death," he whispers, and with that breath, he is gone. Dawn finds the valley still and luminous. Bells toll from Assisi. Pilgrims gather at the Portiuncula, laying flowers upon the bare ground where he died. Within 2 years, the church will canonize him. His name will echo across centuries. Saint Francis of Assisi, the poor man who called the sun his brother and death his sister. But in that moment, before fame and sainthood, there is only the wind through the olive trees and the echo of a song that seems to rise from the earth itself. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures. Centuries have passed since that autumn day in 1226, yet the echo of Francis still walks through the hills of Umbria. The city of Assisi has changed, its walls restored, its merchants long gone. But his presence lingers like the scent of olive wood after rain. The wind that once carried his voice still moves through the cypress trees, whispering, "Pax et bonum," peace and good. In the decades following his death, the world rushed to claim him. Churches rose in his honor, pilgrims flooded Assisi, relics were enshrined in gold. Yet beneath the stone and ceremony, the real Francis remained hidden. The barefoot man who sang to birds, kissed the dying, and rebuilt faith one heart at a time. The order he founded grew vast and complex. Kings and popes sought its favor, scholars filled its libraries. But for Francis, legacy was never about monuments. It was about freedom. The freedom to let go of everything that binds the soul to fear and pride. "A man possesses only what he gives away," he once said. For only in surrender does love become real. His life was a paradox that the modern world still struggles to understand. He owned nothing, yet lacked nothing. He lost everything, yet found joy. He embraced death, yet taught the world to live. Even now, his vision feels revolutionary. Imagine him today, walking through the noise of our cities, through streets glowing with neon instead of torches, past towers of glass instead of stone. What would he see? The same hunger he saw in the merchants of Assisi, men and women chasing more, but finding less. He would not condemn, he would weep, then smile, then invite us to begin again. Because Francis's story was never about escape from the world. It was about transformation within it. He did not reject creation. He saw it redeemed. To him, every leaf, every face, every breath was sacred. In a century obsessed with power, he preached tenderness. In a church drowning in wealth, he rediscovered poverty as praise. And in an age of violence, he spoke of peace not as dream, but as duty. When the Crusaders marched to the east with swords, Francis crossed the same desert unarmed. When cities walled themselves against plague and fear, he entered the leper colonies singing. His courage was not loud, it was luminous. 800 years later, his words still cut through the noise. It is no use walking anywhere to preach unless our walking is our preaching. And so the question remains, one that every generation must answer anew. What are you holding that holds you back? What walls inside your soul still need rebuilding? What silences are you afraid to hear? Perhaps that is why Francis matters now more than ever, because he shows that holiness is not far away. It is simply honesty lived to its fullest. It begins not with miracles, but with a single act of surrender. He walked away from comfort and found calling. He walked away from wealth and found wonder. He walked away from himself and found God. And so the story of St. Francis is not finished. It lives wherever someone chooses love over fear, simplicity over excess, peace over pride. If his story moved you, carry it forward. Rebuild what is broken around you. Begin where you stand. Love what the world ignores. For every generation must decide again whether to cling to gold or to walk barefoot into grace. This is Chronos History TV, where the past still speaks.